Hey guys, welcome back. Gonna make a video today which is a little bit different than what I normally do. I'm gonna call this a public service announcement where I want to talk a little bit about the Honda Odyssey and some alternator issues that these cars have, and specifically what's causing them around the spool valve assembly and some oil leakage. So look, if you watched any of my videos in the past, I own a 2014 Honda Odyssey. And I want to highlight what I think is a significant area of concerns for owners of the fourth generation Odyssey and also some other models. You can see on the screen here a technical service bulletin that Honda put out in 2020. And you can see the affected vehicles to this issue, including the 2008 to 12 Accord, the Cross Tour, obviously the Odyssey, which I'm talking about, and even the Pilot that ran up to 2015. I'm going to speak to this issue from the perspective of a Honda Odyssey owner because I have some firsthand experience with this issue. But if you own a vehicle that is on this list, you should be paying attention to this as well. I think you need to be proactively keeping an eye on your alternator. Specifically, the alternator in these vehicles is susceptible to an issue with the spool valve assembly, what is also known as the front rocker arm oil control valve, as is stated here on the TSB. It's an unrelated component within the engine bay, but the reason this is such a problem is that it is situated directly above the alternator in these models. Now, why does that matter? Well, due to a design issue with this spool valve assembly, this component is prone to start seeping and, quite frankly, eventually leaking oil as the gaskets inside of this assembly begin to degrade and wear out. And I want to show you a picture as I'm going to scroll through a little bit through this TSB so you can see this. But this spool valve assembly, has some gaskets on the inside. You can see them here. There's one of the gaskets that is shown on the screen. There's actually another gasket within this upper half of this component. We'll talk a little more in depth about why this matters. But as these gaskets begin to degrade and wear out, that oil will start to seep and leak. And again, in isolation, I'm not sure how big of a problem this would be, but due to the location of the alternator in these vehicles, this oil leak is a significant issue. And over time, that oil is going to make its way down to the alternator and cause it to fail prematurely. Why am I telling you all this? Well, for starters, the primary issue is a safety issue. The alternator, just as a little background, it really provides power to the vehicle while it's running. And I'm not a car expert by any means, but what I think the alternator effectively does is it converts mechanical energy from your engine into electrical energy that powers basically all the electrical systems and components within your car. So if that fails, you could be easily stranded somewhere. You could be stranded somewhere remote. You could be stranded somewhere at night. You could be stranded somewhere dangerous, or potentially all of those three combined. And if your alternator fails, and the reason I'm telling you this is it's likely to do so due to this issue, it's really not one of those things where you can just get to it when it's convenient. When your car has no working alternator, it really has no power source, outside of whatever the battery, could provide, which is not a whole heck of a lot. If your alternator is failing, you may see some sort of red battery light on your dash. If you see that, you really need to take it seriously and get somewhere as quick as you can where you can address this problem. These alternators can fail, and they can fail very quickly. The second reason, I want to bring this up is alternator replacements are very expensive. If your Odyssey alternator goes out due to this issue, you are easily looking at paying, over $1,000, maybe up to $2,000 to have the work done just for the alternator, at some kind of shop, whether it's independent or you take it to the dealer or wherever you prefer to take your cars. You could address this, hopefully, before your alternator fails. You could also want to replace this after your alternator fails and you're looking to protect that investment that we just talked about. So, this video isn't necessarily meant to show you how to do these repairs, but I do want to make sure that, we raise awareness here and make sure that you have an understanding of some options in terms of how you might do this. So the first option here is you can just replace these gaskets. There's one gasket here that you can see on this screen. There's another gasket, as I mentioned, sort of hidden up within this upper part of this spool valve assembly. You can go in and just replace these two gaskets. And look, it is by far the cheapest option to do this repair and will likely stop the leaking that you're experiencing. Now, having said that, while it is a cheap option, the problem is that Honda does not sell these two gaskets, one here and one hidden up here, by themselves. You can find some, quote, other options on eBay or Rock Auto, but just know that these aren't genuine Honda parts. And, as such, their compatibility, their longevity, you really can't guarantee that or know that. Now, having said that, this is a relatively easy DIY repair if you are comfortable doing work on your car. If you do basic maintenance, you can probably do this yourself. In fact, if you want to go over to Eric the Car Guy, his channel, he's got a video that walks through this issue and exactly how you can repair, using this method, just replacing the gaskets. I highly recommend watching his video. He knows infinitely more than I do about actually fixing cars, and he's awesome to watch. Just consider being the messenger of one of the options. The second option that you have is to actually do the work as is laid out in this TSB. And again, TSB 20-023 was put out March 5th of 2020. This is the official TSB that Honda has put out to address this issue. You can see that they say, the front rocker arm control valve is leaking. This is also known as the spool valve assembly. It talks about the gaskets having deteriorated, the groove is out of specification. This is probably the option that I am most comfortable with buying this part and actually having this work done. I'm going to scroll back down here to page 3 of this TSB. Again, within this option, what they are actually replacing is the top half of this spool valve assembly. You can see they talk about here replaced. They are replacing these original bolts. They are replacing the plate in between the top half and the bottom half of the assembly. And they are replacing the bottom gasket, and they are replacing the gasket within this upper housing. What they are not replacing is this lower rocker arm, or the lower part of the spool valve assembly. You can actually see here it specifically says do not remove, and this is significant. Now, remember how I said the alternator wasn't cheap? We're talking well over $1,000, potentially up to $2,000. Well, a new spool valve assembly isn't cheap either, and you're going to need to purchase one if you decide to go this route and do this option. Now, look, if you walk into your local Honda dealership, you can probably expect to pay between $400 and $500 for this assembly, so it's not cheap. If you do a quick Google search, 30 to 60 seconds, you can find this cheaper online from a genuine Honda source, so I would recommend doing that. The fact that these are genuine Honda parts is a big reason that I personally feel more comfortable with this option. Again, you don't end up needing the bottom half of this assembly. So yes, it does sting a little bit, knowing that you paid for some of the parts that you're not ultimately end up using. But at the end of the day, this should solve the issue. At least the Honda engineers believe that it will. They obviously, put out the TSB. If you take this to a shop, if you take this to a dealer or an independent shop, I would estimate that you would pay somewhere between $500 to $800 to do this repair. Again, the main reason for that is just the part itself is expensive. This is again a $400 to $500 part. If you go to the Honda dealer, it is cheaper if you buy it online, but at the end of the day, this is an expensive part. The labor for this is actually surprisingly little, and because of that, this is why I mentioned you can potentially do this yourself if you are comfortable doing this. Again, I would recommend going to Eric the Car Guy, who can give you some more information on this. This is another repair that's not that difficult to do, but again, it's the one I feel the most comfortable with, even if you take it to a shop, and that's what I did personally. I took it to a shop just to make sure, because I didn't want to mess around with this. I wanted to make sure it was done right, and again, this is pretty straightforward and should address the issue. You do have a third option here, which is actually to replace the entire assembly, should you feel so inclined. I'm not really sure why you would want to do this. Even Honda doesn't recommend that you could do this. The reason I want to mention this is because if you took this to a shop, for example, you had the alternator failed, and the shop came back to you and said, your alternator failed because you have an oil leak from this, front rocker control arm assembly or the spool valve assembly. You need to replace this whole part. if they tell you that, to actually take out the bottom part of this assembly or to replace the entire component here, you've got to take out some very large and complicated other pieces of the engine, which takes a lot of time. So the cost of this repair goes up dramatically. So again, I just want you to be informed that if you're told this by a dealer or a repair shop, I don't think you need to replace this entire assembly. In fact, I would recommend you print off, and I've got a link in the description here, print off this TSB, take it to your mechanic and show them, say, hey, this is what Honda recommends that needs to be done. You really only need to replace the top half of this assembly, including the gaskets, and it should fix the issue. So look, as a Honda owner myself, I'm disappointed. I'm a little disappointed, number one, that the alternator failed. Number two, I'm a little disappointed that Honda didn't proactively reach out to me. It's a safety issue. I'll be transparent with you guys. My family got stranded on the highway due to this issue. The alternator failed. We had to get towed, and this ended up being very expensive in terms of replacing the alternator, eventually uncovering, the issue with the spool valve assembly and getting that released. We've spent several thousands of dollars, getting this fixed. Look, the Odyssey is a great vehicle. We've had it for a long time. I love this car. But at the end of the day, I think Honda has a responsibility to reach out proactively when something like this is known and there's a TSB out. Let me know, right? I understand things happen, but it would help me a lot that if I knew to pay attention to the alternator, if I could go in and proactively replace it myself or at least address this issue, I think it would prevent, some people from getting put in a situation that could be avoided. So anyway, guys, I hope you found this helpful. This is really it. Please keep an eye on your alternator. If you've got one of these cars, again, I'm speaking as a Generation 4 Honda Odyssey owner, use the link, pull up this service bulletin. If your alternator hasn't failed, have your mechanic take a look at it, maybe proactively get it done so that you can avoid having this issue on the road. Stay safe out there.